And I don't think that we'll be waiting another 100 years for a pandemic of the scale of the Spanish flu and of the scale of COVID-19.
Hi everyone, this is Dana Lewis, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. All these months of quarantines and funerals, and what do we really know about COVID-19 so far? Should we really be sending our kids back to school? Is a vaccine close? Are we blundering into a second wave by lifting lockdowns? And Britain's scandal inside number 10 Downing Street. The Prime Minister refused to fire his key assistant after Dominic Cummings broke lockdown and, sick with COVID-19, drove several hundred miles across the country with his family. And he was the one who came up with the slogan, "Stay home and protect the national healthcare system." First, we take you to Perth, Australia, and meet epidemiologist Archie Clements from Curtin University. First of all, can you just talk to me about Australia, Archie? I mean, it's actually fared pretty well compared to other countries.
Yes, we've been very fortunate in Australia. We've had a fairly small epidemic here, and we're well past the peak. At the moment, we're only getting fairly small numbers of cases, between 4 and 15, that sort of range. I think we can put that down to a combination of good luck. Obviously, being quite an isolated country, we don't get that high volume of international travel across our borders. And we have a very low population density, even in our cities, and I think that's helped us contain the epidemic. But on top of that, we've also had, I think, a very good government. I think the government response has been very good. Like the United States, we have a federated system, with each state being responsible for its own healthcare system. And what we've seen in Australia is that the state governments and the Commonwealth government have collaborated very effectively in developing clear messaging and gaining the trust of the people and implementing, I think, fairly effective public health initiatives.
I mean, Australia is really opening the doors right now, probably ahead of many societies. Do you think, not only in Australia, but around the world, that there's a danger of opening up too quickly? And again, that leads us into, is there going to be a second wave? Like 1918, that second wave was much more deadly.
I think it's a little bit of a different situation to 1918. In 1918, the public health response was really nowhere near as sophisticated or well-developed as what we have now. And the waves of influenza in 1918 really related to the levels of underlying population immunity and really the unfettered movement of the virus across populations. Whereas here, I think what we've got is a much better understanding of the dynamics of viruses. I think we have effective public health responses that we put in place, social distancing, mobilisation of resources into the health sector as needed. We also have a much healthier population. So in 1918, they'd just come out of 4 years of war. The population was undernourished. There was, extensive comorbidities with other conditions. We don't really have that now. And of course, the 1918 pandemic, that influenza virus was much more dangerous for young people than the current virus. So I think we're in a very, very different situation. I don't anticipate we'll have a big second wave like we had in 1918, but what we may see is numbers of cases waxing and waning according to the level of public health controls that are being put in place in countries around the world.
Well, just very briefly, let me push you on the second wave. Is it going to be bigger than the first wave?
Well, what I think we'll see is, and we are seeing it at the moment, every country around the world is at a different stage of the epidemic. Every country's on a different part of the epidemic curve, and we can see, for example, at the moment, countries like Brazil and Russia are still in the exponential phase of growth, whereas countries like Australia and some countries in Southeast Asia, for example, have moved past the peak, and we're now at that tail end of the pandemic where we're seeing sporadic cases. So I don't think we'll see a coordinated global second wave. What I think we'll see is that wave progressing across the globe at different times.
Will you see a second wave that's larger in the United States, where they're approaching 100,000 deaths? Will you see a second wave in the United Kingdom that, we're well up over 36,000 deaths?
What we're likely to see in the United States, if there is a relaxing or premature relaxing of social distancing and other public health responses, we'll just see a prolongation of the pandemic. So we'll see it stretching out over months, even potentially into next year. And the same may happen in the United Kingdom. I don't think that we'll get explosive waves and then significant drop-offs. I think what we'll just see is a much prolonged peak in the pandemic in the United States.
You were at Imperial College, and Imperial College really they were kind of the tip of the spear on modeling, if I can use that term, predicting dire numbers, which didn't come about on the scale that they predicted. Do you think that modeling was at fault and that many governments were at fault themselves for following that modeling? And many governments, including the Trump administration, feel that they were cheated by some of those forecasts and that they shouldn't have taken as harsh a lockdown as they did.
Well, I think the starting point is that no models are perfect. And I think that the best modelers in the world, and I know the people at Imperial College, will be communicating the uncertainties and caveats associated with their models. It's really up to the governments, the politicians, to interpret those models appropriately and seek advice from the experts. I think that what the models were showing was, if no public health response was put in place, this is the scale of pandemic that we would expect. If we were to rely on the build-up of herd immunity, this is the level of mortality that we would expect to get there. Now, of course, no country has refrained from implementing public health measures. No country has allowed the virus to spread freely across the population, and therefore we haven't seen the scale of illness and mortality that those early model estimates presented. If politicians were saying that they felt cheated, it's because they either don't understand or they don't wish to understand what the models are telling them. It may well be that what the models are telling them is not convenient for political purposes.
The United States was late to lockdown. Would you say that? And do you think the UK was late to lockdown, and that's why we're seeing such very, high and tragic numbers of deaths in both the countries?
Yes, I think they were too late to go into lockdown. The Director General of the World Health Organization was urging countries from the very early stages of the pandemic, whilst the pandemic was still largely contained in China and other areas of Southeast Asia. Before the pandemic really hit Europe, the Director General of the World Health Organization was telling people, you must act now, you must prepare, you must put in place public health measures to prevent the pandemic. Many countries didn't, or they did it too late, and that includes, unfortunately, the United States and the United Kingdom. And now we have the President of the United States criticising the World Health Organization, when really, if he'd followed the advice of the Director General, we would not have seen the scale of death and illness in the United States that we're seeing now. You
mentioned China, and Australia obviously relies on a huge amount of trade with China, and China's threatened Australia for supporting that investigation into the origins and the Chinese response in the initial outbreak. Can you just explain to me, in terms of the science of this, never mind the politics of it, why is it important that we get to the bottom of that, and what do you think we still have yet to learn?
Well, I think that we can be fairly confident that the virus originated from a spillover from a natural host into the human population, most likely through the trade in live wild animals. We can be confident of that because it's been known for a long time that there's a large diversity of coronaviruses that are present in wild animal populations, particularly in bats, and that as humans come into contact more with those wild animals, either through population growth, incursions into natural environments, increasing fragmentation of natural habitats, wild animal trade, what you see is more interaction between humans and wild animals, and then you increase the probability of spillover events from happening. So that scenario is well understood. There's a lot of evidence to support that as the origin of many emerging pathogens. There's nothing to suggest that that's not the case in this particular situation. And really, I think what we're seeing is a certain amount of obfuscation. And you rightly say that this is my expertise lie very much more in the science than in the politics, and I can't claim to understand necessarily the motivation for political obfuscation. But really, in my view, that's pretty clearly what's happening here.
Do you think the outbreak began in a lab in Wuhan?
I think it's very unlikely.
Why do you say that?
For the reasons that I've already explained, that the process that led to the spillover of this virus into the human population is well understood, and it's happened on many occasions. And there's no virological evidence, there's no genomic evidence in terms of the makeup of the virus that suggests that it is in any way modified or altered by human scientists.
It may not be altered, or it may not be weaponized in that kind of sense, but it may be that they were studying bad viruses in the lab in Wuhan, and it may just be simply that it escaped from there, also as a possibility.
Well, I think it's a remote possibility. I think, given the level of risk, when you're talking about a very highly regulated laboratory environment with very high standards of biosecurity, you compare the risk of an accident happening in that scenario with the risks associated with the uncontained and unregulated trade of wild animals, then the magnitude of the risk of the latter is very clearly much greater than the magnitude of risk of the former.
I'm very curious what, in the last remaining minutes that we have to talk about, what you think we've learned about this virus as we've come to try and deal with it since January, February, March. In an interview I watched that you did recently, you talked about immune responses and a possible breakdown in immune response. Did I get that wrong?
What we've observed with
you were really talking about immunity and whether immunity is what we know about immunity and whether we can rely on immunity once you've had the virus and you've had an immune response to it.
So coronaviruses are dealt with by a different part of the immune system so for example, influenza viruses. And it can be quite challenging, for example, to develop a vaccine that triggers the right part of the immune response to effectively prevent or contain infection by a coronavirus. They tend to invade through the upper respiratory system, which has got a different immune system to the lower respiratory system, the lungs, for example. And what we've seen is in natural infections, there's a variable immune response. So some people have a strong immune response, particularly those people who have a severe infection, but people who've had a more moderate infection tend to exhibit a lower grade immune response. It's not currently understood the duration of immunity. So what you typically see with immunity is that the level of immune response increases quickly after the infection, then plateaus and then drifts off, leaving you susceptible to reinfection. For coronaviruses, that period appears to be shorter than other viruses where we have effective vaccines. So there are a host of challenges associated with developing a vaccine. I think that, given that we're now seeing over 100 groups around the world working on a coronavirus vaccine, I think it's very likely that we will find one. And then the question will be how quickly and equitably a vaccine can be produced and then rolled out across the world. And, will the coronavirus still be with us? Will we still be in a pandemic situation when that vaccine is ready to be released? And that, I think, that's an unanswered question for now, but that may have some bearing as on whether or not ultimately a vaccine is actually produced and rolled out.
Archie, do you think that the virus is mutating? Is this a fixed target for people working on vaccines, or is it a moving target?
From my reading, it appears that the virus is relatively stable, and the vaccine manufacturers and scientists who are looking at this are fairly confident that they can create a vaccine that will be effective in years to come. It doesn't appear to be mutating as quickly as, for example, influenza viruses, where there's a need to develop new vaccines every year because of changes in the virus, and also the diversity of influenza viruses and the need to target vaccines of particular strains of influenza on an annual basis. At the moment, it doesn't look like that situation is arising for coronavirus.
Why do some people have such a strong immune response and then others do not? So why do some people get just hit over the head with this to the point that it may result in a fatality or they have to be hospitalized, and other people have very mild reactions? I know it's a question we keep asking, but do we understand the answer any better?
It's the $60 million question, and we don't really know the answer. It could be a combination of genetics, previous history of exposure to coronaviruses. We know that some of the people who die from COVID-19 have an overactive immune response, a so-called cytokine storm, and that probably relates to how primed their immune system is to respond to infection with coronaviruses. That may relate to their past exposure, their past history of exposure to coronaviruses, potentially to other viruses. Really, we don't know. I mean, it may also relate to the dose of virus that people are infected with when they initially become infected, and that has been one of the explanations people have put forward for why so many healthcare workers, for example, have had severe infection, because being in close proximity with severely ill people, the thought is that they may get a higher dose of virus. So those are a couple of reasons that may account for it. It might relate to genetics, it might relate to immunological history, and it may relate to dose of exposure.
I'm puzzled by this idea of a higher dose. I mean, I thought if you come into contact with a virus, you're in contact with a virus. It doesn't matter whether there's a cup full of it or a bucket full of it. But apparently it does, and it depends on the person you've come into contact with. Yeah,
it's a challenging concept, but yes, and it's seen with most other viruses. So even, for example, HIV, that you need a certain minimum dose of the virus before an infection sets in, effectively. And it's not really, I guess, known what that dose is and why it might vary between individuals, but it doesn't just require one virion to infect an individual to lead to replication of the virus in that person and for an infection to take place. It usually requires a minimum dose of viral particles.
Would you take a tube? Would you take a bus? Would you get on an airplane right now?
Well, in Australia, I would definitely get on a bus or on a train. I wouldn't be getting on an aeroplane to travel overseas right now. Aeroplanes are actually, you're no more greater at risk of being infected by another person in an aeroplane than you are being in any other enclosed space, whether it's in an office with somebody, in a restaurant with somebody, in any other enclosed space with them. So the fact of being close to someone in an aeroplane is no more risky than being in any other enclosed space. I guess what is risky about being in an aeroplane is that it brings people together from many, many different locations for an extended period of time. If we're talking an international flight to Australia, you might be in a small enclosed space with people for 12 hours.
So you said you would get on a tube or a bus there, but you wouldn't. I assume you wouldn't do it in London right now.
No, I wouldn't. And that's the reason for that is in Australia we don't have evidence of extensive community transmission. Obviously, in the United Kingdom, you still have evidence of significant community transmission, and that's why I think it's a little early for countries like the United Kingdom and the United States to be actually looking at moving out of lockdown, moving out of social distancing measures, because you do still have existing community transmission, and once you take the shackles off, the virus will rebound, and I think that is a challenge.
Sending kids back to school, is that wise, or is it because they think it's safe, or do you think that promotes herd immunity and that's kind of the thing they don't talk about and that's why they're sending them back?
No, I don't think that's the reason why they're being sent back. I think the reason why children are being sent back is because they're at very low risk of severe consequences of infection. They also don't seem to be contributing significantly to transmission of the virus to other people. So in a situation like the one that we have in Australia, where we have very little community transmission, I see that there's absolutely no reason why children wouldn't be going back to school. And I think that sending children back to school is a relatively low risk. In a situation like we've got in Australia, I would be in favour of it. I think it becomes a little greyer when you're talking about countries where you've got still lots of community transmission. Whilst I think that children contribute very little, overall, you probably need to be doing everything you can to dampen down transmission in countries where you're still seeing quite a lot of community spread.
Herd immunity necessary? Is it inevitable, or do you think that maybe it's not right now because the virus may die away over the summer or for at least a few months?
So I think herd immunity is a positive byproduct, I think, of the infection spreading in the community, but I would never use it as a strategy for containment of the epidemic. Largely because the costs in illness and death of achieving a level of herd immunity that you would need in order to control the epidemic is so high that it's not worth it. By far and away, the best way of achieving herd immunity is through having a vaccine. So doing it in a controlled way, not in an uncontrolled way, through allowing the virus to spread in an uncontained way across the community.
Do you agree with some of these predictions that say viruses like COVID-19 are going to come more frequently and we're going to have them more often?
Yes, I do. For some of the reasons I mentioned earlier. So human population is going to continue to grow throughout the 21st century, particularly in tropical areas of the world, and also in parts of the world where regulation and the ability to ensure sustainable population growth, where the ability to do that is most limited. That's going to bring human beings into contact with more and more naturally occurring pathogens. Unplanned urbanisation, unplanned deforestation, unplanned growth of agricultural industries in areas where there's a greater likelihood of coming into contact with natural pathogens is going to result in more frequent spillover events. And I don't think that we'll be waiting another 100 years for a pandemic of the scale of the Spanish flu and of the scale of COVID-19. I think these things are going to be happening with increasing frequency. And really the salutary lesson from this pandemic, which whilst it's been a horrendous pandemic and has resulted in widespread mortality and illness, it could have been a lot worse. We need to learn from this one. When the Director General of the WHO says, countries, get your act together, sort out your borders, sort out your health systems, put in place public health measures, hopefully with the next pandemic, those countries will act more quickly. Hopefully we'll invest more in science. Hopefully we'll invest more in public health. And in Australia, we have invested for a long time in preparing our public health workforce. Again, this is a lesson that we need to learn for the future.
Archie Clements, Professor, Vice Chancellor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Curtin University in Perth, Australia. It's such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much.
It's a great pleasure, Dana. Thank you.
In the back half of Backstory now, Britain, which has the second biggest numbers of deaths from COVID-19 next to the United States, is reopening. Shops and businesses opening in June, clothing, shoe stores, markets, bookstores. They think that they have beat back the virus. Joe Phillips is a political commentator. Joe, do you really think this is going well in Britain? Right decision at the right time?
I think it's very difficult to tell because we really don't know. We are still very much reliant on the figures. We don't have any proper testing going on. We only really have a headline figure on the number of deaths, which are certainly coming down, and certainly anecdotally, the health service is not being overwhelmed in the same way that it was at the beginning of the pandemic in March.
The real story may be the handling of senior homes. It's certainly the topic of a future public inquiry, which some politicians are calling for. I mean, many seniors were sent by the government back to senior homes from hospitals with no testing, where the virus spread and then killed the most vulnerable in senior homes. I mean, it seems unthinkable. There are echoes of that in other countries, but not on the scale that has taken place in Britain.
No, and you're absolutely right. It's a complete scandal, and it is something that should be part of an inquiry, almost a separate inquiry. But the whole issue of social care, particularly for the elderly, it's a question of funding. It's expensive to keep somebody in an elderly nursing home, a care home. There's a huge increase
But in this case, if I can interrupt though, in this case, it's not a funding issue for senior homes. It was a funding and an equipment issue for hospitals. I mean, they were sent out of senior homes to hospitals when they were ill, and then whether they had COVID-19, whether anybody knew or not, there was no testing, and they were sent back into the senior homes to spread the disease, to spread the virus.
Yes, absolutely. And the staff in the care homes didn't have the PPE, the personal protective equipment that hospitals and hospital staff have. So you've got people who are coming in and out, they're people on very low pay. I mean, the whole thing has been such a shambles, and we know that other countries have managed to do testing quite successfully. We know that, that's one of the reasons that South Korea has been so successful in keeping the pandemic under control. But until we know whether people have got it, have had it, are immune to it, or whether it's spreading, we can't really judge whether the lockdown or the easing of the lockdown is a sensible thing to do.
The headlines They're always hot in Britain, but the headlines are especially roasting hot in the scandal of the Prime Minister's right-hand man, the spin master who sold Brexit with slogans and lies, some would say, breaking lockdown and driving almost 300 miles with his wife and child to his dad's farm and then on to a nearby castle at a certain point. His name is Dominic Cummings. Joe, why does his hollow explanation for his drive to the country matter?
Well, it matters for two reasons. He is apparently joined at the hip to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's Marmite, as we say in this country. You either like him or loathe him. Many people say he's an absolute genius. He's supposed to be very clever. He came up with the Brexit slogan and masterminded the Brexit campaign.
Which was stay at home.
And he came up with the stay at home, save lives, support the NHS. So, he's a good spinmeister, but I'm not sure whether he can spin his way out of this one. I mean, there are several things. One is that he has been sitting in the government scientific advisory group meetings. He's not a scientist, he is an advisor. He's a political appointment. He's not even a civil servant. So he's been sitting in those meetings where the evidence has been gone over, and leading epidemiologists, scientists, doctors, what have you, are working out what we should be doing. So he has been party to that and has been therefore part of the telling the rest of us how to behave.
So does that, before you move on from that, does that somehow taint that advisory committee then? Because it's supposed to be purely scientific, and then the government takes its political decision.
Yes, I mean, one could argue, and I was a spin doctor in a former life, one could argue that advisors could sit in on meetings. But we know from scientists who attend those meetings that Dominic Cummings wasn't just sitting in and listening. He was actually, taking part in them. And he was going back to the Prime Minister and saying, well, this is what they say, this is what I think. Now, obviously, we're not privy to those conversations. But clearly it puts him in a huge position of power, which has dictated the way the government has handled the coronavirus crisis so far, has handled the lockdown, which many people say was far too late, and has handled this, nonsense and shambles of test and track and trace, and also the issue of PPE, personal protection equipment. So Dominic Cummings is at the centre of this because he is at the centre of government. And what
does it say? I mean, Dominic Cummings may survive or may not by the time somebody listens to this podcast, and they probably don't really care that much about Dominic Cummings if they're not living in the UK and they don't even know who he is. But what does it say about Prime Minister Boris Johnson? Because he did not fire him, and a lot of people thought that he would. It seems that he is leaning very heavily on others.
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is if you cannot do without your special advisor, then you probably are not fit to be Prime Minister. Advisors come and go. Prime Ministers are elected. Dominic Cummings is not elected. I think it has shown Boris Johnson's absolutely terminal weakness that he is so dependent on this man. There's a lot of angst and anger, I think, amongst his own MPs and their constituents who have obviously gone through great sacrifices over the past few weeks and now feel that it's one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. So I think it has damaged him. The most important thing is, there are two things really. One is this is a public health crisis. The political crisis is of the government's own making and of Boris Johnson's own making personally. But if you're going to manage the public health crisis, which is not going to go away anytime soon, you need to have the trust of the people with you. And if you've lost that trust, you've also lost the moral authority. So if, as we're saying, there might be a second wave, or we might have to look at bringing lockdown measures back in, how are you going to do that to people who just don't trust you anymore?
Joe Phillips, thank you. And that's another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. Please, if you like Backstory, sign up to listen to more and share our link. Stay safe, everyone.